So welcome to SADS Foundation's Living with SADS webinar. Tonight we're talking about mental health and PTSD. I'm Marcia Baker, the Program Director for the SADS Foundation. So on behalf of the entire staff, we welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. Our presenter, Dr. Sam Sears, is a cardiac psychologist at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. He is a nationally recognized expert in the psychological care and quality of life outcomes of patients with ICDs. He has a faculty appointment in 2 departments at the university, psychology and cardiovascular sciences, where he provides clinical services to the East Carolina Heart Institute. Sam has published over 150 articles in the medical literature on the psychological aspects of cardiology. We're pleased that he's joining us again tonight on this webinar. Many of you have seen Sam in previous webinars for the SADS Foundation or at various speaking engagements he's done for the communities. We've received an overwhelming response for tonight's webinar with over 160 people registering. So with so many of you, I might ask that you'll turn off your camera during the presentation, and then we can focus on Dr. Sears' presentation. So we're fortunate he's volunteering his time tonight and could work us into his very busy schedule. So we've allotted some time following his presentation for questions and answers. You may add your questions in the chat field, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sam Sears. Thank you for spending time with us, Sam.
Thanks so much, Marcia, and thanks and hello to everybody tonight. It's great to see everyone in this important group. It's always a pleasure and an honor to work with every one of you and with this group. So tonight's a big challenge to talk about a rather complex psychological syndrome called post-traumatic stress disorder. And part of the challenge is because experiencing cardiac arrest, experiencing significant cardiac disease is a little bit like getting struck by lightning. Most of our patients had no idea this was coming, and it feels like they've been singled out amongst the universe as being stricken with the idea of a cardiac-related problem, often in an age-inappropriate time of life. But the reason that we all love to work with patients like you is because there is a little bit of swagger to the other side of this. When life's thrown everything at you, when life has scared you beyond what you can imagine, you also get to roll out something like this and say, nice try, heart, but I'm still here. And that idea of being able to roll through the kinds of challenges that we face is part of the honor of working with you, and I think the challenge that you face on a regular basis. So while I appreciate the enrollment tonight, I know it represents the significant needs of people dealing with heart-related problems in terms of dealing with trauma and stress that goes along with it. So tonight I want to talk about some of the key issues that go along with PTSD and cardiac disease, and then secondly, to suggest some of the steps we can take to try to address stress and trauma. But let me have the caveat at the beginning that, this is a significant clinical syndrome and often requires much more than attending an hour-long speech about addressing. But certainly this is a talk that's intended to help you understand more about PTSD and perhaps be able to make more decisions about what you might need to be as psychologically comfortable as possible as you move forward. And I'll start with the idea that most heart patients have been told they have PTSD. Virtually every patient who comes to my clinic, in my weekly clinic in cardiology, almost every patient is referred for PTSD, and almost every patient comes in and says, I have PTSD. The problem is that PTSD is a very formal diagnosis, and most patients do, in fact, have some of the symptoms of PTSD, but it's often a little bit too far to say that they all have PTSD. It's more accurate to say that they have some of the symptoms of PTSD, things like ongoing hyperarousability or anxiety, intrusive thoughts about the events that have happened, and strong avoidance, wanting to avoid talking about these ideas. But when you look at the data in heart patients, that depressive disorders and anxiety disorders are common. 1 in 3 patients, roughly, are going to experience an anxiety or depressive disorder. That heart patients, in fact, a third of them right away experience significant distress from all that they've been through. And you can see the red line there in terms of stress. And this is a big meta-analytic study that collapsed across almost 100 plus studies. And so we get pretty good numbers from this recent paper from the Journal of Affective Disorders that, yeah, about a third of our patients are going to have depression and anxiety, and over half are going to have ongoing stress. So it's not a surprise that somebody might say, well, that's PTSD, as kind of a flippant or quick way to describe the syndrome. But the syndrome is much better articulated as having some hallmark features or cardinal features that are what we look for as clinicians. The first is this idea of intrusive or unwanted, repetitive memories of what happened. This can show up in nightmares. This can show up in unwanted thoughts. This can show up in self-deprecating thoughts, ways in which you just don't like what you're thinking. It's a very uncomfortable and disquieting set of thoughts. Then secondly, the avoidance, trying to not talk about or resist talking about it. I think all of us might remember grandparents who might have served in the world wars or in Vietnam or somewhere, and they say, he just doesn't talk about it, or she never talks about those years. And that is actually part of the characteristics of the traditional, what we used to call shell shock, that we would now recognize as PTSD, the syndromal experience of intrusive thoughts, avoidance, trying to avoid, yet it still intrudes, and this sort of circular process of avoidance and intrusions. Then it's also met with heightened arousal, that it's hard to relax. It's hard to enjoy peace in your mind when you have these intrusive thoughts and avoidance going on. And then finally, the idea of thoughts and feelings, just life doesn't seem much fun. It's all about trying to avoid the next trigger, the next worry, the next reminder that things aren't right or that you've lived through something horrific. And of course, PTSD is noted as initiated by a potentially life-threatening experience of a loved one or oneself, in which the experience of life was horrific or associated with potential mortal danger. Some of the other symptoms of PTSD, rather than just the cardinal features, you see some things like avoiding activity, negative mood, avoiding talking about the trauma, avoiding thinking about the trauma, high startle response. So these are people who really don't like being startled. They don't like a surprise happening. Some trouble with, getting confused about where they are, thinking about the event so much that they think they're back in it. They avoid the places things happened. They can't concentrate. They might get aggressive. I mean, this is a pretty difficult syndrome. So when we talk about PTSD, it's important that we have some precision of our words, because PTSD really is this syndrome, not just some of the symptoms of PTSD. Now, of course, part of the experience is getting through it. And that while one has been traumatized perhaps by some of the heart-related challenges and threats, there's also a little bit of swagger and warrior to you, in that you're able to get through it. And we'll talk about that resilience as we go forward. The second point about PTSD that I wanted to make tonight as a general idea is that heart disease is a disease in which the natural response is often to pull back or withdraw emotionally or physically. So we see this broadly in our heart patients that don't want to talk about what they've been through and don't want to engage in any sort of exertion. These are both signs and symptoms that are common in heart patients, but they're also common in PTSD. Another reason why many people might say, well, everybody has PTSD. Well, that's not quite right. Many people have anxiety symptoms that might be part of a PTSD, but not necessarily the full syndrome. Now, why does this happen? Why would someone experience post-traumatic stress? The current theory that we have about this is that situations and stressors cause thoughts and feelings. But when we seek to avoid experiencing something, experiential avoidance is a word we use among clinicians that says this person's going out of their way to avoid experiences, avoid the feelings, thoughts, and physical sensations. So the person who's had a heart attack who never wants to feel their heart go over 100 beats per minute, the person who's experienced a physical threat and no longer wants to go out, wants to stay in the house all day. When the experiences of life result in a desire for narrow or inflexible behavior, the processes, the seeds of post-traumatic stress are sown. Whereas what we hope is that people will accept the experiences, that traumas are part of the human experience, that suffering can't be fully avoided in life, or at least pain can't be fully avoided, but suffering's more of a choice. And so not so much a choice, but suffering is a response that some people can have as they try to avoid experiences. So collectively, this idea of experiential avoidance is part of the challenge. Now, I ran across this video recently. I think most of you will recognize this is Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I want to show you a little video about him talking about his own cardiac experience. And I think there's a few lessons in it for us.
I remember when I had my open heart surgery, the third one, which was just a few years ago, just before we started Terminator 6. And I was like really freaking out. I mean, I woke up all of a sudden and the doctors were sitting in front of me and saying, "I'm so sorry." But unlike what we planned, which was non-invasive surgery to just go through the growings up to the heart and replace the valve, we made a mistake and poked through the heart wall. And therefore we had to kind of get internal bleeding and we had to open me up very quickly and to save your life. As I said, well, great. This is really great news. I mean, Jesus. So anyway, the bottom line is, that you cannot roll the clock back. It's a disaster. I was in the middle of a disaster. So now it's how do I get out of it? So you have to shift gears. You correct yourself, shift gears and say, okay, what I need to do now is I got to get out of this hospital, number one. How to get out of the hospital is, okay, by getting out of bed and start walking. Start walking. First 10 steps, then over sit down around the nurse's station, and then long and long. And then I called my buddies in, and they said, "You guys have to fire me up. You have to count the amount of steps that I'm doing." And so this is what we did every day. Everyone came in there to the hospital, and they said, "Okay, Arnold, get up now. Let's go and walk the hallway." So walking down the hallway, "Oh, you're doing really well. You're doing well." I knew I was not doing well. I looked like an idiot, wobbling around to the hallway. But I mean, the bottom line was I was getting going, and because the doctor said you have to exercise your lungs because if you get pneumonia, you can die. So I wanted to get really going with the exercise, get out of the hospital as quickly as possible, and then get going with the training again. Because I had, in 3 months later, I started with Terminator 6. So I had to be in shape. I had to be able to move around, run around, lift things up, do the fight scenes, and all of this kind of thing. So we did it because I had a positive attitude. I knew exactly how I'm going to get there. I had the support system because none of this we can do by ourselves. I had a whole support system, and it was fantastic. The way all the guys pumped me up and got me going. And when I started shooting Terminator 6, I was all back together again.
So, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger might have had a few more luxuries than the rest of us as we deal with things, but he had some truths there, some wisdoms about both the process of trying to get through things that are threatening and recognizing the value of support and recognizing the value of small steps and recognizing the value of moving about and trying to go through things. The challenge with heart problems is that it's not just simply one place, right? That the challenges of heart disease really are both physical and mental. That, of course, my work focuses on cardiac arrest and patients with defibrillators in particular. But I think, we all recognize that while the heart is the genesis of the problem, that oftentimes the mental side may actually be more challenging. And so it is here where we start to really focus on what is going on inside the patient experience. And I think one of them can be this idea that you can become very protective, both if you're a parent or if you're a patient, that you can become super protective to try to avoid any risks at all. And of course, life has got its own risk. It's almost impossible. And this is just a quick model that to remind me about one of the challenges that we face, particularly with SADS disorders, the conditions that many of you and your families face, is the uncertainty, right? Uncertainty in the context of medical problems is known to be highly stressful because it triggers lots of behaviors in effort to try to make the unknowns known. So we become hyper vigilant and we become focused on, well, maybe if we just get more information, maybe we just go to one more doctor, maybe if we just go to one more expert, we can fix it. Or maybe we can live in such a way that we're careful, so careful that we'll never activate the heart. Or maybe we'll just stay home and we'll be safe here at home. But then you, of course, can't live, and you start to play into that very thing I talked about earlier about experiential avoidance. And we talked about the life-threatening nature of what we're talking about. I mean, sure, death, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. And while I appreciate the humor here, it's certainly problematic in its own way. When you look at all heart patients across the board, all heart patients, and a meta-analytic study, again, a combination of all the studies available at that time in 2017, showed that the average rate of PTSD in heart patients was about 12%. Now, just in contrast, if you were to go and sample a large group of Americans and do tests to see how many of them had PTSD, the rates would be closer to about 4%, okay, with women being higher, around 5, men being lower, around 2, averaging around 3.5 to 4% of the population with PTSD. So here, even in the heart disease population, you have a 3-time greater risk for PTSD. And we have lots of other data. Over the last year, I did some work with the Stanford group, Lauren Schneider and the Stanford group, and we were able to show with pretty careful analytics with 93 people in this study, 50 kids and 43 parents, that, yeah, PTSD in parents was almost 47%. But the rate of kids was about what we'd expect in all of our heart patients. So again, parents are particularly sensitized to PTSD. When you look at sudden cardiac arrest families, very similar kinds of findings. This is an Australian study by Jodie Ingalls and her group, and they showed 44% of patients, families, survivors who have lost a family member to sudden cardiac arrest, that in fact almost half of those surviving family members, in this case were mostly parents, showed a 44% hit for PTSD. Mothers, witnesses were risk factors for depression, anxiety, and stress. And then finally, PTSD in the context of cardiac arrest. So a true cardiac arrest, this is some recent data from Alex Prosciutti and the group in New York, and he showed again that in fact, the elevated rates of patients who have had a true cardiac arrest and survive upwards of 28 to 32%, and they had a 3-time greater risk for what's called a major adverse cardiac event, or a MACE. So that it wasn't just that they were sad and anxious, it's that the sad and anxiety may manifest itself as having more complications down the line. So it really is the case that we have some heart warriors, right? This is not some sort of trumped up idea here that post-traumatic stress is a significant syndrome that often requires professional engagement. But we're certainly going to talk some tonight about how do we create that warrior type of idea. And I think part of tonight's interest is that cardiology was never really built to be a comprehensive service. What I mean by that is cardiology arose over the last 30 to 40 years with high levels of technology, high levels of expertise, and high levels of excellence. In fact, when you look at the data for heart disease, we've had significant declines from 1950 on the far left to 2015, sizable declines in rates of death. That is, we're getting good at saving people's lives. It's harder to die. That's good. Except those, when it's harder to die, it leaves survivors, which is great. But that means that there's more trauma in this group. And when you say, well, health is more than just not dying, health is the complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Well, those are pretty high. That's a pretty high bar. Complete state And so comprehensive care was never really part of the history of cardiology. In contrast, the history of cancer has always involved the psychologic and psychosocial side. You could go to any cancer institute and find psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists dedicated to the care of cancer patients. But there are very few places around the country where you're going to find psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers dedicated to heart patients. This just happens to be here at East Carolina and Eastern North Carolina, but also at Michigan and some of the major medical teaching hospitals. You're more likely to see this kind of expertise. So collectively then, I do think that PTSD is something that everyone on this call recognizes, perhaps some symptoms of PTSD. And part of my call and my background information here is to say, well, let's talk more about some of the symptoms rather than just simply the whole syndrome. And let's see if we can chip away at this a little bit tonight so that we can have a few things to keep in mind about PTSD. So in this latter part of the talk, I want to talk some about what else can we do about it. And I think the first and foremost idea is that defeating disengagement, that the dirty trick of PTSD or PTSD symptoms and the dirty trick of heart disease and cardiac symptoms is the desire to somehow self-protect. That the self-protection process, whether it be mentally or whether it be from a heart rate perspective, doesn't lead you anywhere. And I'm going to suggest that the core psychologic problem that goes along with heart disease is disengaging, pulling back from events, pulling back from emotions, and pulling back from actions. And while that is an oversimplification, it does give us a good working model about what do we do to try to overcome some of these symptoms of trauma. And I'm going to suggest two aims to do that tonight. That first, we'll talk about sort of general supportive care. How is it that we can provide psychologic opportunities for ourselves to heal? And then how do we manage specific PTSD when we think the whole syndrome or most of the syndrome is present? How do we address that? So we'll start with general supportive care, and we'll talk about three elements of that tonight: validation, re-engagement, and what I'll call check your engine. So first and foremost about trauma, and one of the reasons people withdraw with trauma is the lack of validation. So you could imagine, and this may have happened to you, where you come in with an ICD shock, and your medical team goes, "Whoa, all right, it did exactly what we wanted it to do. It saved your life. Aren't you happy? Aren't you glad? Don't you feel great? Your defibrillator works." And of course, you sit there and say, "Well, yeah, I'm happy to be here, but being shocked was fairly traumatic to me. It scared me. It scared my family. It scared the people taking care of me acted scared. The paramedics acted scared. The ER staff acted scared. I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen." And yet, despite this person trying to help you see the bright side, as you will, may have invalidated your experience. The validation process of saying, wow, I mean, what just happened to me? And so one of the parts of validation means that when we get validated, the emotional experience that is ours, whatever that is inside us, that we can both comprehend and synthesize what it means to have that emotion. And when the experience is terrifying, being terrified is an incredibly lonely experience. And so when someone invalidates it, it doubles down on that isolating, inhumanizing, dehumanizing experience. The horrific aspect of feeling like you're going to die is magnified. So validation is really important. Now, the elements of how we can be better siblings or parents or friends to someone who's experienced a trauma is by empathizing first, trying to understand what did they experience, walk in their shoes and validate that. I can see how this would have been horrific for you. And secondly, I think there needs to be ultimately some hope too, which is, hey, that was horrific. but I'm going to be here with you. Just like Arnold Schwarzenegger said, his friends were going to be there with you. I've often said in clinic that I'm like, I don't know if I'm any good at what I do, but I know I'm going to be in the trench with my patients, and I'm going to sit there and we're going to ride this thing out until we get better together. That I'm willing to stay there and validate and walk in their shoes, whatever it takes. Of course, I look like a soldier, so maybe that's some of that military gobbledygook I talk about. Maybe it comes through because, in fact, I believe in the shared collaboration between patients talking about trauma and professionals. And I think you can see the other things, finding the first step forward, usually talking about what happened, acknowledging some of those emotions, doing that together as a team, working to forecast what might come next. How do we go forward? How do we learn from what's happened? And how do we know we're in this together for the long game? These are aspects of validation that I think really help our patients. And then I think for kids, since this SADS group has some good number of kids, and I think these are some of the key elements about, of course, being able to talk about whatever you thought or felt during the scary experiences of life-threatening or even perceived life-threatening. Maybe it wasn't life-threatening, but as a kid, you just weren't sure. Being truthful about that, being able to show emotions to each other, both grown-ups and kids, and recognizing that it's okay and that reassurance matters and that we're going to get back into the groove here. We'll get back into routine and we'll be respectful of each of each other's experiences. So the second part of normative general processes of getting over traumas, I think, is re-engaging. We sort of suggested that earlier, that what do you love to do? And I think when we think about the idea of you re-engaging, it means both re-engaging with your thoughts and re-engaging in activities. Now, I think that might be surprising. Like, how do you re-engage with your thoughts? Well, it just means own them, right? It means, hey, yeah, you did get through this. It was nasty. Yeah, that's not something you want to do again. On the other hand, you did it. You got through it. And find a way to remind yourself that not only are you safe now, but you're stronger. That the traumas and the challenges that we face, while they are sometimes horrific, they do in fact help us build strength for the future. So those are a couple of reassurance ideas we talk a lot about in my clinic, about being a survivor versus a victim. They're both true, but emphasizing that you got through it. And then secondly, getting back into activities, that we can do some of these thought processes, but in the end, we got to get back into the activities that matter and find small ways in which, when we do them, there are ways in which you're taking back your life, taking back control over that which threatened you or harmed you or made it more difficult for you to see the future positively. That when we take small actions, that these small, deliberate, positive actions produce increasingly positive feelings. It is often not the case. You can create positive feelings and then an action. You often have to create the action to create the positive feelings. And we have lots of evidence from that in both depression and anxiety literature that taking actions seems to have significant benefit emotionally. So what do you love to do? I like to talk to my patients a lot about what are the activities you got coming up. I like to talk about what's coming up in our patients' lives. So I say, what activities of fun, intimacy, awe, or peace are coming up? So here in Eastern North Carolina, we don't have a lot to do out here. We got a lot of pigs and a lot of tobacco. So we don't have a lot to do out here, but we do have Saturdays in the fall where the Pirates of East Carolina come together, and greater than half our town is in this stadium right here. I mean, that's a lot of fun for us out here. What about intimacy? Ways in which we feel close to other people. The experience of trauma can be isolating. You can feel like you're on an island. So ways in which you lower the drawbridge. Let people into your emotional castle. Because that actually does make you stronger, rather than just having a moat around you that defends you from other people's thoughts and feelings. Rather, lowering the drawbridge and allowing people to reach you is part of intimacy that really is an important process of breaking down trauma. I think anytime we can be around awe, this happens to be me in front of the redwood forest back in, I don't know, maybe November, summertime. It was summertime. And I'm looking at that redwood forest. My wife took a picture of it and says, you're as small as I thought I thought you'd be up next to that tree, and there you are. And so, I think being in awe of the beauty of the world, being in awe of the opportunities of life. I know that sounds Pollyannish or sort of silly maybe, but there's good evidence that being in awe is something to really be sought after. It's good for us. It makes us humble, and our bodies seem to have some very unique responses to awe. It's considered a positive psychological principle. Finally, activities of peace. I think recognizing that while it's a lot of fun to be stirred up and go out and go see the Pirates play football or go see soccer or whatever it is you like to do, there's also times in which finding peace matters. And I think it's part of managing one's mood and emotional well-being is recognizing, what are the times in life that you feel peace, and recognizing that building some of those times of peace in. Our phones are sort of peace stealers, right? Instead of being calm and noticing the silence of an evening, noticing the beauty of a morning, we're on our phones worrying about the news or worrying about social media or nonsense. And I think recognizing that part of managing anxiety is also bringing in peace, bringing deliberately in opportunities of calm peace. I also want to talk some finally about this idea of general well-being. As I mentioned, the idea of using your phone and engaging in all this information processing all night and all day, and I deal with it too. I try not to do it, but got the phone by the bed, or you're sitting there taking in information all the time. Part of it is that we lose track of our engine. And I'm going to suggest to you that our engine is really our brains. That, fancy cars these days have all these dummy indicators on the dashboard that tell us something's wrong, even if we don't know what's wrong. My car has this thing that says check engine. Well, I don't know what that means. Check where? I wouldn't even know where to look anyway. I'd probably go to the trunk because I don't know anything about cars. I think I know where the gas goes, and that's about it. But our engine really is our brain. The brain's controlling our bodies, but it's also so much about our experience is what's going on here with this guy. And if only we could look at something like this, right? If only we had such a gauge that we would be able to stay away from certain people that look like they're on the empty. And we might even be able to communicate to people, hey, don't mess with me today. But the idea of checking your engine means check your mind. Can you stay up and be aware of how are you doing psychologically? How are you doing mentally? So if you are struggling with those things, to make sure that you do, in fact, have some awareness of it so that you can engage in activities of peace, so that you can engage in activities of awe or intimacy or even fun. Because indeed, how you manage your own emotions are part of the deal here. And although you have been through stresses and traumas, perhaps, it's still a responsibility to take care of yourself mentally. And I think that doesn't really get emphasized very much. We constantly are looking for something outside ourselves, even perhaps coming to this talk and saying, well, this guy's written a bunch of papers. Maybe he'll tell me something smart. Well, maybe, but it may also be the case that you have what you need. You just simply have to double down on the resources that are in your life in order to make them be part of a healing process for you through the stresses and strains that go along with living with heart disease. So we're down the home stretch here. It talked about these ideas of what I consider to be general supportive care, ways in which all of us need to manage our anxieties with or without traumas. And that's still true. As a heart patient, even without trauma, it's important that you manage your own mental health and that you see that as a priority. Because in fact, you do have demands on you. The rigors of being a patient of any sort remain. The challenges of American healthcare remain. These are the things that make it harder to have a condition like heart disease. Now, in this last part, I'm going to talk about PTSD care, but I want to do that with a couple of caveats. First and foremost is that really PTSD, as I've tried to emphasize tonight, really requires a degree of professional care. So I'll address that. Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about how to process the past. How can we process the past in order to try to make peace with it? And then finally, how do we embrace the future as elements of a trauma recovery process? But I want to emphasize that let's not be naive. Trauma is not going to be resolved by simply listening to a talk. The very nature of a PTSD experience means that it is not something you want to spend time talking about. It's something you do want to try to avoid. And as you do that, the trauma creates more problems. So the ability to have a tour guide, a professional, a collaborator, a kind, compassionate co-worker that's going to help you work through this remains an important idea. So I don't want to oversell tonight's talk, but I do want to say that, of course, professionals are an important part of this. And the reason is because professionals use what's called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is a series of techniques in which professionals build a process by which that which you avoid, you learn to gradually approach. So if there's some fear that you have about what's happened or some trauma that you don't want to talk about and does in fact bring you a lot of disquieting and discomforting experiences, that you have somebody who can work with you and allow you to approach those kinds of strains and stresses and traumas in a systematic way in order to be able to accept parts of them and ultimately all of them as part of your experiences of life. So these exposure therapies can be things like exposure in real life. They can be imagined. In many of your cases with heart-related traumas, we're often talking about what happened in the past. But what's tricky about being a heart patient is that some of the things that happened in the past could happen in the future, whereas a lot of the, let's say, military trauma is unlikely to occur on the state side, at least at the moment. And so some of the exposures that we might do, let's say in a VA hospital, might not be very likely in the civilian world. But in the heart disease world, they might be more likely to happen again. So we really do have to both understand what's happened. We have to be able to imagine it. And down in that right-hand corner, interoception means being able to experience that horrifying experience again and be able to recognize that it won't harm you, but rather you'll be able to experience it, encounter the unpleasant sensations, encounter the unpleasant memories and feelings, and find a way through them. And that's why this idea of professional care is just so important tonight, because these are complex topics and complex reactions. Our bodies are magnificently sophisticated in efforts to try to protect ourselves. So working through this requires some patience and some compassion and some steady work. It reminds me of these guys. I think about what it must have been like to encounter this degree of threat without freaking out. I mean, look at the way they have somehow come to a peace with relative risk. And I see my patients this way. Often my patients wow me, amaze me by their ability to sit on the edge of a beam, a medical beam, if you will, the way that these workers did, building the skyscrapers of New York City. And, I think the deal is that these folks learned to have some degree of comfort with some threat. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all go up and do this as a way to master our fears, but I'm simply suggesting that the circumstances of our lives sometimes expose us to stressors that we probably didn't want, but that we've actually become quite expert at dealing with. There's actually a whole series of these photographs, including the guy who took the pictures, of how these folks got used to managing risk and threat I mean, there's no safety harnesses on these people. I mean, this was before the government regulated some of these construction workers. This is from a recent paper of ours. I know tonight's not about ICDs per se, but I wanted to highlight this. This is from a brand new paper on PTSD from my research group. And there's a couple things I wanted to highlight about how we think about trauma in our heart patients. So in this particular instance from the paper, we were talking about the experience of cardiac arrest and ICD shock. And that this experience gets filtered through various mental health history, genetics, experiences, and expectations. And then it shows up in our thinking. Do we have worst case scenarios? It shows up in our vigilance for our body. Oh man, what is that? Is that a tachycardia I'm having? Hey, I'm going to stay home tonight, okay? Because I think if I get excited tonight, it'll be too much. And so in here, when you have all three of these or versions of this, we start to move toward the more formal diagnosis of PTSD. And then you can see below in this paper where we talk about things that each of these important stakeholders can have for our patients that are dealing with trauma. When we're talking about cardiologists, it's certainly to acknowledge emotions and give reassurance about the connection and understanding. For psychologists and mental health providers, it's to inform people about what happens when we have shock experiences or traumatic experiences, and how do we identify some of the stimuli that'll serve as triggers. Or over here in families, in which we want families and friends to validate the emotions of someone who's been through a trauma and say, I know it's tough, but I'm here. We're here and we're going to get through this together, and we're going to reinitiate trust that our future is okay. So while this is a specific graph or figure about ICD shock, you can see it has broad, similar impacts for whatever the case is. And we've written, and there are papers out there written for patients about trauma and ICDs in particular, because that's what my lab's been focused on for almost 29 years now. And this came from a previous talk to SADS where I was talking about the importance of safety nets. And I enjoyed this because this isn't my slide. Somebody on SADS put this together about 5 ways to develop your safety net. But the idea is that part of exposure ultimately, and part of encountering your traumas and managing them by approaching them, is to feel safe again. And that to recognize that it's always a work in progress, that we're always moving in some direction about our perceptions of safety with heart disease, that we never really get to the finish line. You're always trying to move toward feeling safer and being able to focus on sustaining that positive and safe feeling. So just a couple or more points about specific trauma care. A good friend of mine, actually a former trainee of mine, just recently published this book called Making Meaning of Difficult Experiences. And in this book, she basically suggests that individuals who have been through difficult memories, difficult experiences, traumas, that part of the process, if they're not willing to see a professional, is to try to go through this, process the past. And specifically, this is the tips laid forward in this book. First, pick the memory that's been bothering you. Write out the experience from beginning to end. So actually tell the story. Read this over at least 2 times after you write it, and spend 30 minutes sitting there thinking about the experience. Now, that's about the last thing you want to do. But that's exactly part of what these researchers and clinicians are suggesting. Include all the details, all 5 senses, and as many thoughts and feelings as you can, and feel those emotions again. Because in pursuit of the idea that this is about avoiding the experience of trauma, avoiding the reaction to trauma, then reliving it in this way helps to undo some of its intrusiveness. Essentially, that which you're trying to avoid, you tend to, and that reduces its intrusiveness. Continue this 3 times a week for 30 minutes. Continue until it no longer stirs you up, and engage in self-care and self-compassion. I suggest this with caution because I think this is a lot to ask of many people. I'm not sure I could do this very easily, but I think it's something that if you're somebody who really, really, really is avoiding a mental health professional or has stigma in such a way that you just can't imagine yourself getting care for what ails you, I'd rather you try something. And I think this gives us at least a way to start. Now, finally, one of the things about trauma and about PTSD is that it shakes up one's present, but it also shakes up one's future beliefs. Embracing the future means being able to review what's happened, recognizing the future does in fact remain unwritten. And so engaging the people who love you and people who care for you and having a routine discussion about, yeah, how's this going today? How am I doing? How am I doing in terms of embracing the future versus worrying about the past? How do I continue to build an optimistic interpretation or an optimistic outlook? How do I identify that, yep, I've been through some tough times, but I did get through it? Planning that this is a long-term play, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and then finally recognizing and engaging in what I call recursive review, meaning go back and round on quality of life. Okay, how'd that work out? You know, I went to church this week. How did I like that? I went to the ball game this week. How did I like that? What did I do there that didn't work? What did work? To actually be mindful of how you're making progress. And to be flexible in how you determine that success and setting goals, as I mentioned, cheering on small victories, embracing some of the unknowns. And in particular, I think attending to silver linings, that while attending and paying attention to maybe the good in the midst of bad seems really silly or naive, there is good evidence that finding a silver lining in virtually every situation has sizable psychological benefit. It's not always possible, but finding some way in which you become wiser, stronger, more engaged in your future is part of how you overcome these threats. And certainly seizing the day, the carpe diem, moving toward the future and welcoming what's ahead rather than worrying about what's behind. So in terms of things to do about PTSD, this idea of general supportive care that I talked about, validation, re-engaging in life, checking your engine, specific PTSD care, things like consulting a professional, processing the past, and embracing the future. These are the elements that I think are important to keep in mind as we think about all that we've been through. Because this idea about nice try, adversity tried to get me. Nice try, trauma tried to sideline me forever. Nice try. I'm still here. I'm going to be here. And everybody in my family wants me here. And I need to be here. Right here, right now. Not stuck in the past. Right here, right now. Grounded. I love this shirt. They whispered to her, "You can't withstand the storm." She whispered, "I am the freaking storm." Thanks very much. Happy to take your comments and questions at this point, and thanks for your attention. I can
Thank
see
you
it.
so much, Sam. We really appreciate all the information. And I want to just supplement the information that Dr. Sears has shared with us with a compilation of mental health resources that we had a genetic counseling student intern this summer compile for us. And Aaron has just posted the link to our website with all of these resources in the chat. And so I want to just draw your attention to that so you can copy that and check those out. There's lots of books and webinars and website information. So it's very comprehensive list. So just to supplement what Dr. Sears has shared tonight. So if you do have some questions, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask it verbally, or you can post it in the chat feature. And the raise hand feature is under more. Generally, if you go to that, you'll see a raise hand button. So feel free to put any questions in the chat as well. So if you watch for hands raised. Go Pirates. All right. Okay, any questions posted or that you'd like to comment verbally or ask it verbally? Here's a couple people. Okay. Anna, let's go for you first. You're the first hand I saw there. So you can unmute. Go ahead, Anna.
Hey, my name's Anna Claire Varnado. I'm actually a RN home health nurse. My 16-year-old daughter went into cardiac arrest 2 months ago, and I did CPR on her. So I think we're both dealing with the PTSD from the event. I just wanted to know if you had any teenage specific suggestions or resources for us. It's a tough age.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think we can all recognize how traumatizing that would be, of course, with both the situation, what needed to happen, and what you were both thinking and feeling. I mean, I think first and foremost, you got to really have the opportunity to acknowledge each other's strengths and courage in that situation. I think secondly is to recognize, yeah, I mean, this is traumatizing. So we want to talk about it. We want to be on the same team about it. I don't want to ignore it. I think teenagers do need to be able to know we can talk about it. They don't always choose to for whatever reason. And I think getting them professional support, even if they're not sure. The way that I would suggest that in a teenager is to say, look, you only have to go once. I just want you to talk about what you went through. And if you decide you don't want to any more care after that, that's fine. I think there's value to one time going through what happened with a professional and being able to lay it on the line, because you may be protecting each other from explaining exactly what you experienced, which again is a point of avoidance. And so that can actually persist. So I do think that there is both an openness to acknowledging the emotion, but also the importance of connecting to a professional at least one time, really for both of you, either independently or jointly, but probably independently, so that you can tell your story, so that it doesn't get trapped inside your head. And some of the distortions that terror does for us is that it does distort our perceptions of reality, our perceptions of probabilities of the future. Can make us feel like, oh, that this just happens all the time, when in fact it doesn't happen all the time. Trauma and terror isn't supposed to be something that happens all the time. And so the opportunity to work through that, I think, is really important. And that I don't have any other wise ideas except to say, thank you for sharing, and I think recognizing, you got some guts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Lorraine, you have a question. Your hand's raised. Go ahead.
Thank you. I experienced cardiac arrest in a hospital environment, and my device went off 36 times in 21 minutes while they were doing CPR and getting me on ECMO. Yep. And I've done the talk therapy. And now I'm at a point where I feel like there's a lot of stored trauma. And I was curious if you use any somatic processing or hypnosis as a part of your practice.
I don't use those. I tend to be a little bit more stodgy in terms of a researcher and academic, so I don't tend to get too far away from what I would consider to be the most, excuse me. I don't get too far away from the evidence base, even though I think there's some value in some of those techniques. They don't have as much empirical support, meaning, the science of what we do is an important part of my work. Having said that, I think that, talk therapy and continuing to pursue some of the somatic experiences is certainly fair game. And for those listening, that has to do with experiencing tachycardia, experiencing often nausea, vomiting, experiencing some of the discomforts that go along with the way in which the body is responding to the experience of trauma, and experiencing that again, but having it, if you will, resolved. Because indeed, repeated shocks like that, particularly if you believe that you were in big danger, which you may very well have been, it becomes really important to be able to continue to work on that. And so while I don't think therapy forever is exactly the way we should be going at it, I do think that it's a complex trauma that often requires lots of different modalities. And so in your case, I think there is evidence, or at least I'll put it this way, there's some hunch, clinical intuition that doing some other things might be helpful to you, because that is a significant trauma. I'm glad you've done some work. I wish it were 100% curative, but it sounds like to me you're trying, and so Lorraine, I'm appreciate your comments. I just encourage you to keep at it. Keep swinging the axe at the tree a little bit, even if it looks like a redwood. Swinging the axe is swinging the axe is probably a sign of success in and of itself, because you're approaching that which terrified you. And I think when you're doing that, anybody looking at you would have to be inspired and actually recognize your courage.
Great.
I'm sorry, I've got a cold, so I'm starting to break up a little bit.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, Susan Green, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I just had a question about, you were speaking about re-engaging, and I was just wondering, how do you re-engage when you're in the middle of a hot phase, where I've been shocked, and then you go a few days, you're back into it, and then it happens again, and they schedule an ablation, but now you have to wait 3 weeks. So it's like, how do you, sort of control that when it's a constant up and down for a period of time after going 9 years with nothing?
Yeah, I think I have to expand my definition of engagement there a little bit, right? So engagement might be finding some peace. Engagement might be, hey, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the park and sit and just look around. I think trying engagement in a case where there's ongoing unknowns often just means being deliberate to find peace. Now, I know that doesn't sound powerful. I know that. But what doesn't work is sitting on your hunches waiting for the next shoe to drop all day. That arousal, that hyper arousal, that is PTSD, and it's understandable. It's completely understandable. Like, that makes sense. Anybody would do that, except that's not what works. And it reminds me of the literature around ICD patients. They say, well, I never want to get shocked, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm never going to exercise. Well, that's kind of understandable, except that's the exact opposite wrong answer. Those who exercise are less likely to get shocked. And so you're like, wow, so what's natural? If you, quote, do your own research, you'd be wrong. So I think, without being semantic here and somehow trying to split hairs, I simply mean engagement being deliberate in what you seek while you're in between ablations, or you feel like you're not in a safe spot medically. I would suggest that that's the time in which you do sort of deliberately engage in peace activities, deliberately find places that you do feel safe, so be engaging about pursuing some degree of peace, awe, comfort, feeling alive. I think I tend toward nature in those situations, but it doesn't have to be. It could be an art gallery, it could be a temple, it could be it could be anywhere that you feel a sense of peace.
Thank you, Sam. So we have a comment in the, pardon me?
I wish I had more dramatic advice for Susan, but I actually think there's my thoughts about that are that doing something beats doing nothing, even if doing something that might be considered not a lot, like going to a park, is still doing something, and that actually has massive advantage. Anyway.
Thank you. So in our chat, we have a comment on any tips for finding a mental health professional to work with. We don't have a Sam Sears everywhere. How would
Okay.
they find a professional?
So one of the keys with being a heart patient is trying to find a psychologist that's comfortable with what's considered health psychology. So, you know, at the major teaching hospitals, we've got a few people that are hyper specialized like me, but there are most places and most states have a psychology association, like the North Carolina Psychology Association. Every state has a psychology association, and you can go online and actually search for medical psychology or health psychology. So it has to do with the psychological processes associated with coping with disease. Now, you're going to want them to know much more about long QT syndrome than it's just a heart condition. But you can coach them on that, and they're usually willing to learn. So I think the idea is to try to identify either via the State Psychological Association or via your family doctor, a mental health provider that is comfortable managing the psychology of disease rather than the psychology of mental illness, if you will. And those are some distinguishing words. You can go right on Google. I mean, there's all kinds of find a therapist kinds of sites on there. But the difference that you're looking for is somebody who can treat health problems. And I think that's the key. Chronic disease, health problems, things like that.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, you had your hand up. Sadinsky, did you raise it, lower it? You still have a question?
Hi, Lisa.
She's unmuting. There we go.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I actually had a comment for Anna Claire, and we've been chatting privately. But I just wanted to mention our daughter is 20, but she's had multiple instances of cardiac arrest. And I just wanted to say that she found it very helpful to attend a heart camp sponsored by her cardiologist practice at Boston Children's. And for that, specifically for the validation, for the shared experience. And what she has said to us is that she found it very helpful, and I found it helpful as a mom, to talk with other people who have this unique life experience, because not a lot of people can relate to it. So I just was suggesting, if your kids have access to talking with other kids who have also experienced it, we found it helpful. That's all.
I wish I had thought about that answer, Lisa. Great answer. Great addition to the answer. I think that's really important. So yeah, anywhere you can find those. Again, some of the major children's hospitals were able to find that. Oh, good. Somebody noted, yeah, Psychology Today. That's the search engine I was thinking about for mental health providers. But anyway, you know, the major teaching hospitals tend to have some awareness of the major cardiac camps. That's certainly massive value as well. The universality, you know, that's what's so great about SADS, is that, you know, there's universality. That is, the people on this call know intuitively what many of you have felt. And that reduces the isolation, that reduces the experience of trauma and single-outedness, you know, the lightning strikeness of this. And that's fundamental to the human experiences, feeling like we're not alone on this planet, suffering in our own way.
Okay, thank you. So Darren's iPad is listed with the raised hand. Darren, do you have a comment, question?
Yeah, wait.
Sorry about that. I was on mute.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right,
First
Darren.
of all, hi. Thank you for speaking. It's been very motivating. You know, one of the issues that I have is being withdrawn. I've spoken about this before, and I have ARVC. I've had it for 28 years. And to me, it's like walking through a minefield. You know that you're eventually going to step on something. You just don't know how bad it is or when it's going to happen. So I've kind of, isolated and tried to do all these things that you said don't do.
Right.
Basically, if I stay here, I'm going to be safe, and I'm closer to the hospital or whatever. And I know there's no simple answer, but what could be a step that I could take to just kind of break through this? I mean, I've got a vacation planned to go to Hawaii next month. That's my big step. But I'm still very nervous about that, and I'll be traveling with my family. It's a 9-hour flight. What are some of the things I can do to help keep my sanity?
That's a great question. Now let's pay this back a little bit here. Right? So you've had ARVC for 29 years. Okay, 29 years ago, ARVC, you might as well have been touched by a Martian. Okay,
Right.
You knew absolutely freaking nothing about ARVC. I mean, as recently in my career alone, we went from this mystery disease to being able to tie it down to genetics, and hopefully we're going to get to some therapeutics for it. Okay, so we've gone from absolute Martian disease to a potential therapy. Now, let's be cautious about those words, but for lots of reasons, we're optimistic for the first time ever about some things that might help halt the disease progression. And then secondly, you did things that seemed reasonable. I mean, it's not like there were a bunch of people telling you the right thing to do either. So I think you tried to do the right thing. So I would take the blame off you of yet another way, that way. So historically, you had a Martian disease. Secondly, you did what you thought was the right thing. And only now, with the hindsight of these years, do we know, okay, this is probably where we're at. Now, the problem with this idea of walking through a minefield, as you described it, is that, but you are walking and you are waiting. And if you always are looking for a mind, you're wasting the day in which you walked and you didn't step on one. So it's kind of a tough deal. Now, I'm teasing you a little bit, obviously. I don't mean this exactly, but I'm saying to you, there's evidence that you're okay too.
Yes.
So in a way, another way to say that is every day you don't step on a mine is a day in which the evidence is building that you are actually safe. So fundamentally, the way that we think about this, the way that we teach cardiologists is first, our patients must have a sense of safety. And whether that comes from a device, whether that comes from a medication, whether that comes from smart doctors, whether that comes from faith, whether that comes from their puppy dog, I don't care where it comes from, but our patients have got to feel safe. And we have to pull together those resources to feel safe. So I love Hawaii for you. I love it. And I don't love the plane trip, but I think you'll be fine. Okay. I mean, I can't sit still that long. But the point is that I want you to look for evidence that you're safe as hard as you're looking for evidence that you're not. The problem is that we're wired to look for danger. That's how we survived as a species. That's why we're kind of a little bit neurotic or a little nutty, okay, as a species, because the nutty ones noticed the growl and said, I think that might be a tiger. The dum-dums went, that's probably just a dog, and then they're not here to find out whether it was or it wasn't. Okay, so there's a little bit of we selected out for being a little nutty. Okay, but that means we got to work against that and to remind ourselves we are actually safe, and you are safe to go to Hawaii, or somebody would have told you not to. And in fact, the vast majority of our patients, will be absolutely fine most days. And I mean, we put things in place to make sure that even if it was a day that you stepped on a mine, that it'll be just an annoyance and not an explosion.
Okay. Yeah, and I understand. I've already spoken with my electrophysiologist, and he said, "Yeah, go do it. Just get up and walk while you're on the plane, so you don't, don't go crazy and don't get any blood clots." But it's that
That's
initial.
true of everybody. That's true of
Yeah.
everybody on the plane, right? I mean, that isn't only you.
True. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the response, and I can see the logic in it.
Yeah, well, Darren, let me say another thing. The fact that you asked a question and you showed up tonight says to me you're already doing the right stuff, and you planned Hawaii. To me, there's plenty of evidence you're on the right track, even though you kind of humbly asked it, like, I don't know what I do everything wrong. I don't hear that. I actually hear a bunch of steps in the right direction. Get the minefield. You're still taking steps.
Great. Thank you very much.
Peace.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you all for joining us and sharing your questions and comments. This webinar has been recorded, and so if you missed any of it, want to watch it again, we'll send out the link to all the registrants to view it again. So appreciate your participation. Thanks so much, Sam. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.